This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
4 students at Kent State University in Ohio are dead.
Nobody is exactly sure what prompted the action, but the National Guardsmen opened fire.
4 days of increasingly violent dissent had come to this. This was Kent State on May 4th, 1970, one of our generation's defining moments.
Ask not.
That's one small step for man.
In their children's time, if not in our own time.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Our Generation, sponsored by AARP.
If you want to understand why this generation is so deeply divided, all you have to do is come here to Kent State University. Now, this is a quiet, serene campus today, but it wasn't that way in May of 1970, when student protesters and National Guardsmen stood eyeball to eyeball in one of the bloodiest and most tragic confrontations ever to take place on a college campus. And as you'll see today, many of the people who participated in those events are still fighting over exactly what happened those days and what lessons we should learn from it.
The Vietnam War had divided America in a way that would have been unthinkable during World War II, just a generation earlier. By the spring of 1970, U.S. troops had been fighting in Vietnam for more than 5 years. During that time, protests were continuously staged against the war and the draft. When I visited Kent State, I asked 2 students to join me to experience one of our generation's defining moments.
All I really knew was the 4 dead from, like from the song and from maybe one paragraph out of a textbook.
It was really a generation that was pitted against itself.
The events that unfolded at Kent State were set in motion when President Richard Nixon spoke to the nation on April 30th, 1970.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam.
We began to notice buildings being painted all over town. U.S. out of Cambodia and similar phrases to that. So there was a protest beginning almost immediately.
There was a trash fire that was set in the street, and there were windows broken in some of the businesses downtown.
The police decided to order a curfew, and what they did was they ordered all the bars to close, which meant then now you have thousands of people, some of whom have been drinking for a while, and others who are just simply angry because they're being kicked out of their favorite Friday night pastime, and they're all flushed out onto the streets at the same time.
I am distressed and appalled at the destruction within the city during the past 8 hours. As mayor, I have declared an emergency exists.
Authorities in Kent were determined to keep the situation under control, and they made a fateful decision.
Approximately 600 National Guardsmen from Akron and the Cleveland areas are deployed either on campus or in the community nearby.
We got a call that we would be heading to Kent State because of a riot, and the police couldn't handle the situation.
This minute the building is erupting in huge flames, crackling. You can hear the ammunition.
The students were rallying on campus this time, and right on the edge of the commons happens to be an old wooden building which was used as the ROTC center. It represented the military, and someone started throwing some Molotov cocktails through the window.
Firemen were trying to put the fire out, and students or rioters, whichever you call it, were cutting the hoses.
The wooden structure was totally leveled by the blaze, and Governor Rhodes, who visited the campus this morning, promised to crack down on those involved.
These people just move from one campus to the other and terrorize the community. They're worse than the brown shirt and the communist element and also the night riders and the vigilantes. We are going to eradicate the problem.
It felt strange from the beginning. As soon as you got on campus, everything was different. There's a tank sitting in front of the library. You know how many people go to class and see a tank sitting in front of their classroom?
Many people were there not only to protest against the war, protest against the expansion of the war, but they were there too to protest the presence of the National Guard on campus.
There were guards stationed all over the campus like sentries, and there was a really tense atmosphere. Students were going to classes, but they had called a rally for noon that day.
At noon, students gathered on the Commons. They rang the victory bell and rallied in the shadow of the National Guard, unaware that the Guards' rifles were fully loaded and that the men holding them had orders to advance. Next,
I saw the person, I aimed at him.
You aimed at him?
I aimed 2 times. I even took the safety off.
Our Generation, 1970. April 10th, Paul McCartney announced the Beatles were breaking up. June 10th, President Nixon signed legislation lowering the voting age to 18. December 23rd, the North Tower of the World Trade Center became the world's tallest building.
Kent State University in Ohio has had campus violence for 3 nights, causing the National Guard to be called in.
The National Guardsmen that arrived in Kent State found themselves face to face with students, in some cases, members of the same generation. This was truly a generation pitted against itself, but after almost 40 years, why was that generation still divided? We've returned to Kent State today to better understand May 4th, 1970, talking to reporters, historians, and the people who were there. Ed Grant led a unit of guardsmen that day and has returned to Kent State today for the first time in 30 years.
We got the call about noon. Right around noon, we had to get back down here to the Commons right away. There's large crowds gathering up on the hill at Taylor Hall. We could hear the victory bell ringing.
A bell on the campus Commons called students together again today for another rally. It could have been a warning signal for what was to follow.
So by 2 minutes to noon, how many students are standing out here on this Commons?
I would say roughly there were, about, at that point, maybe a total of 3,000, 2,500.
People really thought, you know, they had a right to be there, and they were determined to stay there, and simply by staying there to express their protest.
We had 3 partial companies lined up, about 105 men altogether.
So what are you thinking as you come down here and
I said, this is the biggest mistake we ever made.
Why was it a big mistake?
When we come in here, we're walking in the middle of a surrounded situation. And I said, if anything happens here, we've got problems. So Captain Snyder asked me if I would jump on the back of a Jeep and try to grab a certain ringleader.
The guardsmen decided that to end the demonstration, they would have to silence the victory bell.
And as soon as the Jeep started out, they knew what we were going to try to do, and the rocks started coming. So I couldn't even get, couldn't get near the guy.
As the Jeep advanced toward the students, the riot act was read to them through a bullhorn.
The warning was issued several times, but the students were angry and they stood defiant.
When somebody comes out and tells a bunch of young people, you got to leave, you can't do this, without telling us why or any reasons, many of the students and I myself started chanting back the National Guard, ho ho, there we won't go, and ho 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 Chi Minh.
The students would not be moved with words, so the guardsmen marched with weapons drawn towards them.
What are you seeing? What are you looking out and seeing from this point here, looking back at the ROTC building in the distance?
This group, what they saw was guardsmen in a formation all the way across in front of the burned down ROTC building.
Guardsmen were given the order to move out, but first the students were peppered with tear gas fired from rifle-like launchers.
Well, the guards started coming across in formation with their M1s in this position. When they got about halfway from the ROTC building to where we are, some of the guardsmen began to fire tear gas, and they would come over and hit, and we're hitting back there.
The students were forced up a hill by the tear gas. Some of them started throwing gas canisters back at the guardsmen. Others threw rocks.
Started up the hill. I got hit in the head in the helmet with a rock on the dented my steel helmet. And then I saw the person, I aimed at him.
You aimed at him?
I aimed 2 times through the field here and going up the hill to make people drop rocks.
For most of the students here, they don't believe that those rifles are loaded.
That's right. They're more fearful, I later found out from my research, of the bayonets and the actual presence of the guard.
But in reality, those rifles are locked and loaded.
Rifle, bayonets, tear gas we had, no face shields, no riot batons, nothing where we could non-lethally stop anything.
You had tear gas masks, but nothing.
That was another contributing cause of that shooting. This was really hot that day. It was probably 85 or 86, 87, I would think, somewhere in there. It was hot. The heat started building up inside the gas mask. It was all white steam, and I couldn't see. None of us could see. By the time we got to Blanket Hill, we couldn't see. We went up around Taylor Hall. We had them on the run pretty good at that time. Got lined up again, and Captain Snyder says, okay, we're going to keep pushing straight away that way. Well, what happened, up past the pagoda, there was a football field.
Right.
What we didn't know at that time was back behind the football field, there was a fence. That we didn't know. That's why you need the police that are familiar with the area here to be with us, to tell us what's going on.
How does that make a difference if there's a fence there?
That's one of the prime things you do in a riot. When you push people, you make sure they have a way out.
But the students did not have a way out. The guardsmen were still surrounded and quickly losing control of the situation. Up next.
Suddenly, from over the hill, there was rifle fire.
The Vietnam War divided America, even within families, within generations. Supporters of the war stood opposite an anti-war movement, the likes of which the nation has never seen. In New York, in Chicago, tensions were rising. And on May 4th, 1970, the line that divided America was drawn across the campus of Kent State University. Students began to gather on the Kent State Commons at noon that day. They rang the victory bell and called for others to join them. When the National Guard moved in to quiet the bell, students threw rocks. When the guardsmen advanced, the students ran up Blanket Hill. Surrounded by a fence, the students were trapped. The guardsmen realized their mistake and began to retreat.
Anytime you turn a unit around and move backwards from the direction you were moving, that's going to be interpreted by whoever's rioting as you're bugging out. You're getting out of there. And then that eggs them on.
So what was happening as they were coming back?
As they were coming back, we've done it before. We would turn around, go down on one knee, and aim.
So that's standard procedure?
No, it's not standard procedure, but that's what we would do. Just to slow them down, make them think.
Right.
And then we get back up and move again. Here, that didn't work.
I was walking with a friend in front of a skirmish line coming up from the practice football field. And I said to my friend, I said, Al, shouldn't we be, going a little bit faster? And he said, why? What are they going to do, shoot?
Suddenly, from over the hill, there was rifle fire.
When they started firing, I remember crouching down, sort of that instinctive reaction that you have to get into a fetal position.
I couldn't believe that they were just firing. I mean, they just turned and fired. I didn't see anything that
provoked them anyway.
Provoked them.
And I just started screaming, they're shooting their guns, they're shooting their guns.
And I remember jumping on the ground, covering my head, hoping I would not get hit. I could hear the bullets hitting the ground around me, and I couldn't figure out why they were shooting at me.
We immediately ran down to Johnson Hall, went through the bathroom, and as we're running down there, we're laughing and saying, oh, they're shooting blanks.
I was with my friend Linda, and she grabbed me and pulled me into the building.
And about that time, I got hit in the back while I was laying on the ground.
You were laying on the ground, you get hit in the back?
Yes. I was lying on the ground, and I get hit. Felt like a bee sting.
But you didn't see the shooting itself? You heard the shots?
Yeah, I just heard the shots. Then we came back out After the shooting stopped.
What did you see?
The bodies laying out there.
We finally came out, and it wasn't until I saw a student coming up over here screaming that they killed them, you know, and I just couldn't believe what had happened. And I got up to about this point, and I saw the students lying on the ground, and I went down to where Jeffrey Miller had been shot.
When you saw him laying on the ground, that's when you really knew that they weren't blanks.
My whole reality changed, yeah.
I asked a couple students who were gathered around me. I said, you know how to turn somebody over with a back injury? And they said, yeah. They said, it'll be risky and dangerous. I said, no problem. I'm not going to die laying face down on the ground. They rolled me over properly. I was laying there looking up at the faces of the students who were looking at me. And all I saw was fright and terror in their eyes.
Someone came in and told us that people had been shot. And we came out of the building and walked up the service drive. That's the drive in the photograph that so many people are familiar with. And from a short distance away, I saw the body of Jeffrey Miller.
One young man dipped a black flag of revolution in the blood and waved it about as a symbol of the students' anger and frustration.
After the shootings, I would say probably close to 1,000 students came down, and we came to this area over here that's kind of dug up and sat down right in front of the guard and basically said, if you're going to shoot somebody, you know, shoot us.
And we said, if this crowd gets up and just runs at us, they're going to be able to take our rifles.
You said you were not a protester.
Correct.
So what in that hour switched to where you were ready to die?
I saw what people with guns that are given orders can do in a situation.
Everything's going crazy, and everyone's worried that there's going to be that the spectators are going to get involved, and there's going to be a big riot, and they're going to attack the National Guardsmen, and maybe just, you know, rip the guns out of their hands or something. And this geology professor, Glenn Frank, kind of took control with a bullhorn.
I don't care whether you've never listened to anyone before in your lives. I am begging you right now, if you don't disperse right now, they're going to move in, and it can only be a slaughter. Would you please listen to me? Jesus Christ, I don't want to be a part of this. Please. I'm begging you also. Follow me out this way. Follow me.
The whole crowd, after what he said, we just all stood up and we started to move off.
As the students got up and left the Commons, so did the National Guard. In their wakes, 4 students lay dead. Another 9 were wounded. No one expected the war to come home like it did at Kent State. May 4th, 1970 divided our generation, and that divide still separates Americans today, just as those in Kent, Ohio are still divided on what happened that Monday afternoon.
And you've never heard an explanation for why it happened?
Just from my experience, I know why it happened. One shot will trigger the rest. And I think that's
off a chain reaction.
That's just what happened, I'm sure.
In the first few weeks, I thought it was essentially random. But then as I began to do research and read about it and talk to people, I think that few people were clearly hit with aimed shots. I think Dean Kahler, the most seriously wounded student, was hit with aimed fire because he was hit several seconds into the shooting, laying on the ground.
You've forgiven the guardsmen for what happened?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't easy. It's not easy all the time, but yes, I have. I mean, if I didn't, I would be bitter and angry and not a nice person to be around.
The students who watched from the Commons on May 4th now engage a new generation on understanding one of their defining moments, like Laura Davis, now a professor at Kent State.
I don't feel as though I'm teaching them. I feel as though they're allowing me to work with them, and that we're working together to try to figure out how do you tell the truth about a situation that is so complicated, but it's so important.
As for Mark and Rachel, the students now have a better understanding about one of our generation's defining moments.
One thing that really was interesting to me was seeing how this had affected their lives. You know, they've become teachers, professors, psychologists. You know, they've written books, they teach classes. That was really interesting to me to see how they had had this experience, they had taken it with them. It had really affected them.
It was more than just the students and soldiers whose lives were changed at Kent State. All of America was watching, and all of America was touched by the tragedy in tiny Kent, Ohio.
There has been a singular myth that's been produced by the protest against the Vietnam War, and that is the belief that students brought about an end to America's involvement in Vietnam. The reality, however, is far more complicated. It was not because this generation rose up in protest against the war that it came to an end. It was because millions of Americans living in small towns and communities like this decided the price of victory was simply too great. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.